I want to start at the most basic level for people who do not follow these issues obsessively, who are trying to grapple with them and think about them kind of from the first principle, and that includes myself. So let's just begin with the most basic way of thinking about this, which is, what is the best way to think about the relationship between a depositor of a bank and the bank itself? Is the person who's depositing money nothing more than a creditor whose investment the government has decided partially to insure up to $250,000, or is that kind of an archaic way of thinking about it, and there's a different relationship now between bankers and depositors?
No, that's technically that's exactly accurate. And it's not just that the government decided. In the 1930s, we had bank runs all the time that were similar to Silicon Valley Bank, except it was everywhere and people would lose everything. And so the government and banks kind of cut a deal, right? And democratically. And what they said is, we are going to make insurance so that if a bank goes under, your deposits up to a certain level, so the ordinary people don't have more than $250,000 in an account, you're going to be insured, so you're fine. So you don't need to worry about your bank unless you are really rich or you're a business with a lot of cash. But in return, and then the banks, they get really cheap funding. So they get to borrow at really low cost, and then they lend at a higher cost, and they essentially get free profit. But in return for essentially being able to use the government's full faith and credit, the government credit card, they have to accept supervision and regulation so that they're not gambling too much with the government's money. And that was kind of the deal, and it prevented bank runs, which are horrible, pretty much until, you could go 1970s, 80s, 90s in various ways. But, essentially they still prevent bank runs, and your bank account up to $250,000 is still safe. There's also a variety of other institutions like the Federal Reserve and the Federal Home Loan Bank program, which create what is known as a safety net for the banking system. So really the banking system is it's a public system. People think about banks as private institutions and bankers as business people, but really they're kind of have a public obligation as well, because they draw so much support from the safety net. But there's good reasons to have a safety net here. Now, I have a lot of rage over this situation, but I'm just trying to give you an analysis of why we have FDIC insurance, why your money is probably safe in the bank account unless you have more than $250,000, and setting up for some context to discuss not just Silicon Valley Bank, but the Fed and FDIC also quietly resolved a different bank, Signature Bank in New York, which is only $100 and something billion of assets, and that's a crypto bank, and they kind of snuck that one in as well.
That's Barney Frank's bank, right? So
that's right.
So, or at least the bank where he's a director. So I'm going to absolutely deliberately provoke your rage, as I love to do. It's actually not that hard. But before we get to that, I just want to spend a couple of more minutes on kind of the foundational understanding, so we have sort of the basics to work with. So if this model is correct that you just described, or that I described and that you kind of accepted in that attitude, which is, so I'm someone who goes and I have a lot of money, I want to put my money in a bank. And maybe I have a lot of money not because I'm rich, but because I have a startup company that people just invested in. Someone gave me $15 million because I need startup cash for my company to develop a new technology, to pay the people who are going to develop it for me. I need a place to stick my money. I stick it in Silicon Valley Bank because it's a 40-year institution. It's well regarded. It's something that it seems profitable. And then let's assume that the people who run the bank do all kinds of bad and reckless things. They lobby the government for less regulatory scrutiny. They make really terrible decisions. They make bad bets. I think everybody understands that those people who make bad bets and who are reckless should lose whatever gains they would have had, and should basically lose everything, especially if the government has to come in and save them. Why, though, should the depositors who didn't do anything wrong, or who didn't bet wrong, they're just putting their money in a bank that has a well-regarded reputation, why should they lose their money above $250,000 just because the executives of this bank acted irresponsibly?
Well, there are two reasons. First of all, it's uninsured. It's not a secret that the FDIC limit is $250,000. It's plastered everywhere. So if you're a treasurer of a corporation or a municipality or nonprofit, you know the score, and you're choosing to ignore the rules, and that's just capitalism. Sometimes you take a loss if you make a bad decision. And the other reason, and first of all, let's just be clear, uninsured depositors are not going to be wiped out. In fact, they'll probably get 80 to 100 cents on the dollar.
Because the government intervened. But had the government not intervened, they would have been wiped out.
No. The government comes in and sells off the assets of the bank and then pays back the uninsured depositors with whatever they get for that. And Silicon Valley Bank, though it lost money on bonds, those bonds are still high quality. They just dropped in value somewhat. So what would have happened is the FDIC would have come in, taken those bonds, sold them off, and then, today people would have gotten between 30 and 60% of their uninsured deposits back. And then over the next 2 to 6 months, they would have gotten whatever remained from the FDIC selling whatever they could for whatever they could get. And it's likely that people would have gotten 80 to 100 cents on the dollar of uninsured deposits back. So there was no way that people were going to be wiped out from this. There might have been some problems getting access to all of their funding immediately. They would have gotten access to some of it immediately, but not all of it. So really the panic here, and it was a panic, was I think kind of silly. And the idea that you need to backstop so people get 100% of their deposits immediately was just regulators panicking, and that's all this was. But
their argument was, look, even if down the line we get a good amount back, in the meantime we can't pay our payroll, our businesses are going to go out of business, you're going to lose tons of startup, and the technology they would develop that would drive future gross domestic product in the United States. That was the argument.
No, I know, and you've been feeding it to me all day to get me angrier and angrier, so I appreciate that.
Well, I guess what's the answer to that argument?
Well, so these are not innocent. These are not innocent people, right? They know these are rich people. These are powerful people. They know there's a $250,000 limit. So why have they been violating that? When in a lot of cases you have treasurers that don't do that. There are services that you can get at banks called cash sweeps, which let you chop up your $10 million into 40 different $250,000 FDIC insured accounts. Why didn't they use that? Well, the answer is because Silicon Valley Bank was not just an innocent bank. What they were doing is they were saying, if you leave the money from your firm or from, if you're a venture capitalist, the firms that you fund, if you leave them as uninsured deposits with us so that we can gamble with them, we will give you what's called white collar banking services, which is to say below cost personal lines of credit, below cost mortgages, essentially the kinds of things that politicians are criticized for because it's essentially bribery. The Silicon Valley Bank was giving stakeholders in Silicon Valley essentially bribes to keep their money as uninsured deposits so that they could gamble with it. And that's why these guys took a risk. They were also getting much higher interest rates on their uninsured deposits. They were getting more for taking more risks, so they should bear the costs of that. I mean, this was not just that, but Silicon Valley Bank was also a co-investor in a lot of these firms. So Silicon Valley Bank had stakes in over 3,000 different tech companies. And as a condition of those stakes, it was saying you have to have that firm deposit its cash with us in uninsured. So there were a lot of elements here where there was self-dealing, there was a bad regulatory system, and then there was the Silicon Valley Bank was bribing the people who were in charge of other people's money. So this is a nasty situation. These people do deserve to have a minor haircut off of their deposits. And it is completely crazy what the administration has done. And I blame Janet Yellen for this, and I blame the Federal Reserve, and I blame Joe Biden, and I blame Donald Trump. It is absolutely outrageous that they have made these guys whole. This was just panic and corruption and greed, and it was totally outrageous and disgusting. And I am disgusted by it.
So let me ask you, Matt, if you talk to the people in Silicon Valley who wanted this is their argument. Their argument is this: look, there was nothing special about Silicon Valley Bank. The reality is There's a ton of regional banks and community banks in the United States that are suffering in large part because the Fed raised interest rates. Now, I don't really get that argument since the Fed always telegraphs, and especially in this case, telegraphed it very loudly they were going to do that. But their argument is, we're not any different. And if you don't back this up, and if you don't protect depositors, the thing that's going to happen in the next 48 hours, which seems kind of reasonable to me as a prediction, is everyone's going to get spooked who has their money. You heard Ro Khanna, this is his argument, in a regional bank or in a community bank, and they're all going to say, you know what, I'm getting my money out of there as quickly as I possibly can. I'm going to put it in one of the big four, and every regional bank in the United States is going to collapse. And the only thing that's going to prevent that is if Janet Yellen comes in and says, don't worry, we're here to insure every penny of your deposits. Why isn't that a valid argument?
It's not a valid argument because we have a system that's set up to address that problem. Like if Silicon Valley Bank, they had a big bank run and people demanded their cash back. One question that we have to ask is, why didn't Silicon Valley Bank have the cash to give to depositors? Well, one reason is because they weren't keeping enough cash on hands because of the deregulatory choices and bad regulatory decisions by the San Francisco Federal Reserve. But another reason is because they just didn't have the assets they needed, right? The Federal Reserve is a bank of banks. And if you need a bunch of cash, you can just go to the Federal Reserve and say, I have a bunch of treasury bonds or loans or mortgage-backed securities or whatever. I need to borrow from you. I'll give you these as collateral. You give me cash. I'll give it to my depositors. When things blow over, they'll come back and redeposit the money. And we have a system that's set up to deal with large demands for cash. The reason Silicon Valley Bank couldn't take advantage of that system is they didn't have the necessary collateral because they were insolvent. Most of these regional banks are not insolvent. And also, most of these regional banks are funded by insured deposits. So people with less than $250,000 who have no reason to move their money. Silicon Valley Bank was funded 97% with uninsured deposits. Signature Bank, which is the other one, that was Barney Frank's bank, and Ivanka Trump was on the board of that one before Barney Frank was. That was 90% uninsured deposits. The next most likely bank to fail, which is called First Republic, that has about 67% uninsured deposits. And from there, it goes way down. So we're really not dealing with a system that is, yeah, there's some trouble because the Fed keeps raising rates. But as you put it, the Fed has telegraphed this. These guys just chose not to hedge because it would actually their own employees were telling them, you got to hedge. This is really dangerous as interest rates rise. And the bankers were like, we don't want to. We won't make as much money. So they were making these choices. They were remitting some of the extra profits to the uninsured depositors in the form of what I've said before, these quasi-bribes. And they're a pretty unusual bank. Most regional banks are not like this. So you might have an initial panic. You might take down one or two or three other banks, but it'll blow over. And then you will have reimposed market discipline. Instead, what we did is we said, everyone's going to be made whole. Silicon Valley Bank depositors who took these massive risks, they're going to be made whole. All banks except for Silicon Valley Bank and Signature, their funding costs are going to go down, and we're going to hand them all the full faith and credit of the United States that they can go off and gamble with. And there we go, problem solved. That's what we did instead. This is just like a panic, and instead of dealing with banking panics, which is the way that we should, which is to just use take out the bad banks that are insolvent, you let them go insolvent. And everybody else, you lend them to tide over the panic. They freaked out and did a giant bank bailout.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.